the consensus is fairly broad after the first 2 years of his term that not a lot of progress had been made. Certainly, he put in a lot of effort, and he did important things. In his first full day in office, he issued an important memorandum on transparency, signaling that this would be a hallmark of his administration. Several major projects that were pursuing transparency in the administration came forward, and a lot of energy went into those projects. But we didn't see the kind of change that one would expect from transparency, and that I think you all know can be produced by transparency. And so in giving some thought to that problem, why hasn't there been that much change in 2 years, it occurred to me that perhaps the transparency community, people like myself and others that you've heard from today, perhaps we haven't communicated well enough to the government side what it is that we want, because transparency is a very general term, and nobody knows exactly what that is. We, the transparency community, perhaps had been unclear in our demands. So I began to write about this and began especially to think about it, and among other things, I think the substantive information that we would want from government include information about deliberations, that is the deliberations of both parliaments and also regulatory bodies. We want information about management, which essentially is where the money is going. And we want information about results. That is, are we seeing success when money is put to a particular task? Are things improving? There is statutory law here in the United States that's designed to bubble up information about results so that the dollar spent dollar spent and results that are a product of that spending can be compared. It never has really been well implemented, but there's a chance in the future that this will be well implemented. All the other data that the government has, it's fine to publish, but it's not necessarily the heart of what we want for transparency. So weather data, for example, or agricultural reports, or information about all the different industries that are regulated by arms of the U.S. government. There's nothing wrong with publishing that data, but the centerpiece, I think, of transparency is that information about deliberations, about management and results. We also went to the task of modeling data that we thought was important. That is, I sat down and collected people from the transparency community here, including the Sunlight Foundation. Daniel was a participant and many others from his organization, but lots of other groups and individuals as well, to try to create data models for the important parts of our governmental processes. We've gotten through 2 of them at this point, 2 of the bigger ones, legislative process and the process of budgeting, appropriating, and spending money. So we spent a lot of time on that, figuring out what the data would look like if we were to get it published. Now, some data is already there, and obviously we use the structures that exist for that. Some parts of our legislative process are not represented in data at all, and so we put forward this data model with the idea that it might guide the future iterations of publication by our Congress. Budgeting, appropriations, and spending is both a congressional and an executive responsibility to publish information about that, but probably more an executive branch responsibility than a legislative responsibility. And among other things that are rather striking about that area, obviously to know where the money goes in the executive branch, you have to know what the agencies are, what the bureaus are, what the programs are, what the projects are, and then what the outlays are, what the actual spending is. We don't have in the United States government, believe it or not, we don't have a machine-readable government organization chart covering even the first 2 layers, agencies and bureaus. There's a document called OMB Circular A11, and Schedule C of that circular is a list of agencies and bureaus with their code numbers next to them. But that's a PDF document. It's not a machine-readable document. So we're really behind. I think our executive branch is very behind on publishing data in good formats for the public to use. But we've gone ahead and created a machine-readable version ourselves, which we'll be publishing in the next few weeks. At any rate, we've modeled this data and put those models out there. But probably most importantly for this discussion, I put together a paper on publication practices for transparent government. And this was in consultation with people who actually work with data. I, like Daniel, I'm a lawyer, and I'm just sort of backing my way into technology and into data. But I interviewed people and talked about them and wrote a paper that actually sort of straddles the world of legislation and the world of data, trying to speak both languages at the same time, if you will, and came up with a set of 4 practices that should result in a better transparency, publication practices. And those practices are authoritative sourcing, availability, machine discoverability, and machine readability. Most of you are probably familiar with these concepts, so I won't spend a lot of time on them. And there's actually copies of the paper sitting at the table over here, and you can look through them. But in briefest summary, authoritative sourcing is putting the data someplace that people know to look for it. That is, most likely having the producer of the data be the publisher of the data, or a delegate that is very closely associated with the producer of the data. So it could be that Congress decides that the Library of Congress and the Thomas system is the authoritative source, or it could be that Congress itself directly publishes. Whatever it is, just decide where it's going to be published, publish it there forever so that people can have confidence of where to find it. Availability are a variety of good practices, and Daniel referred to some of these in his earlier talk, including information that is complete, information that is always there, information that is not subject to any kind of legal restraint, any intellectual property restraint, that's free, that people can access any time for any reason. Machine discoverability is a set of practices that many of you are familiar with, again, ways of publishing data so that it can be found. And the Internet is obviously a huge, massive machine discoverability machine. And publishing data online in ways that browsers and search engine spiders can find it is machine discoverability. And machine readability, which is quite closely related, is the practice of organizing the data in such a way that computers can learn its meaning and gather its meaning, communicate that to users so that information can be found. We actually have a society that can access the information. Now, doing all these things, authoritative sourcing, availability, machine discoverability, machine readability, that's part of the problem solved. What will have to happen after that is for society generally to get to learn how to use this information. So it's not automatic that you have transparency from following these publication practices, but over time, civil society will get to use the information, and you'll see progress in the form of new websites, new services, new access to information. One way that I'd like to illustrate this is by going to the newspaper on any given day. Take a story that about something that's happened in politics. For example, last week, yes, it was just last week, Congress passed a payroll tax holiday. So the taxes on their pay will be lower next year than they otherwise would have been. And I went to the front page of the Washington Post, and I copied the front page story, and it was something about whether or not the Republicans were going to fight a political battle. And the sub-headline said there was a $148 billion package. That information, unless you're a political junkie, that information doesn't really mean anything to the average person. And then I went to the financial section. And the financial section is full of charts and graphs, detailed information that people can use to look up how their financial situation is affected by the prior day's events. Then I turned to the weather section. And the weather section has maps and icons and numbers and graphs that show people how the day's weather will affect them, whether they need to bring an umbrella or wear a coat or not. And I went to the sports section. And the sports section, it's hockey season right now. The sports section has detailed charts and graphs that show what happened in the previous day's games, what players are playing the best, and what's happening in the games in the coming days. Detailed information on many different walks of life can be found in the newspaper, but not what's happening in Congress. And I think that's very telling. Over time, with proper publication of data, our newspapers will start to have that kind of detailed information that might be a chart or a graph that would tell everybody how their payroll tax would be affected when a particular bill passes, for example. To round out the work that we've done, in addition to the modeling, to combine the modeling and the publication practices that we've recommended, we put out grades. And there are copies of the grading sheet are also there for you to look at, where we just took the entities that should be published as data, and we assessed how well they're being published and gave letter grades like you'd give to school children, both for the legislative process and for budgeting, appropriating, and spending. And the reason we did this is because to communicate these complex ideas to the media and sometimes to our political leaders, you have to speak to them a little bit like school children. And so this is a simple way of illustrating to the public how well information is being published. And so far it's not being published terribly well. But we'll be returning to this in the fall and regrading based on progress. And we'll see if there's been any progress in publication of information. The reason why we publish this way, the reason why we talk about it this way, is to try to get a broader discussion about it, so that people who write stories for newspapers who are not technical experts can write stories about it, so that our politicians can be pressured to advance the ball on transparency. And what that will do, hopefully, is put the people in this room, the people here who work in the House of Representatives, in a position to tell to tell their bosses, oh, I can deliver that. I can make that happen, when they come and say, we need to make sure that we're transparent. So hopefully this work will help to advance the ball on transparency. The measures that we use, authoritative sourcing, availability, machine discoverability, and machine readability, are loose. They're not the tightest, most precise measures, but over time I think they'll get better. And this is one way I think of grading the quality of transparency that's available, and hopefully will advance the process of making our government more transparent. So thank you. I look forward to hearing more and to speaking to you based on your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now for a slightly different perspective on the question of assessing the benefits. We've heard from the perspective of a think tank from within the Parliament, Bob Reeves of the House of Representatives.
Thank you, Andy. Actually, we have some similarities in our presentation. I'm going to talk mostly about transparency with regard to what is it and how do we measure it. I want to start out by just telling you a little story. A couple months ago, we were talking about some of these meetings that we were planning on having, and it just kind of came to my mind that, you know, we've been doing all these projects this year, and we're trying to improve our transparency, but at the end of the day, I can't go to my boss and say, look, we've done this, we should be 80% transparent now. I couldn't do that. So I said, I got to look into this. I got to figure out how can we do a better job internally. I mean, external entities are going to do what they want to do. They're going to rate us, you know, based on what they think is best. But I think internally, for us and for our projects, we should have a way of assessing ourselves as to whether we're doing the right thing. So one of the groups that works for me is our communications group, and these are a set of really creative people. You know, they do all our signage, they do things like invitation for the speaker's office, book covers, all of this creative stuff that we need to have done in the clerk's office. So I called the chief and I said, you know, Phil, I said, can you come down? I just, you know, I want to brainstorm about this idea of transparency and what it is and how do we measure it. So Phil comes down and he brings a couple more people with him, and we sit down and we're talking, and I'm telling him my idea, and I'm saying, you know, I want to be able to kind of like self-assess this. You know, could we put a chart on our website that says, here's kind of where we think we are? And I'm looking at them, and they're just kind of glassing over a little bit on me. And you know, they started asking me questions like, well, what's the definition? What are we trying to accomplish? And I was kind of blowing by that. I'm saying, oh, well, we don't really need to know that. I want to know whether, you know, if the changes we're making in the House Live, is this good stuff? Or is the public going to like this? You know, our civil society is going to say they're doing the right thing. And so the meeting kind of broke up, and obviously I didn't get where I wanted to get because they were kind of looking at me like I really wasn't starting at the right place. And so I said, well, all right, we'll have a follow-up meeting, and I think we scheduled it for the following week. But I decided that, you know, hey, I'm going to go look on the internet, and I'll find out all about the definition of transparency. So I did go out and started to look around, and I found many definitions. As you can see today, many of us have talked about transparency, but no one has said what transparency is. I think a lot of the things that we do touch on a lot of the elements that are part of transparency, but I don't know that we could come up, not today anyway, with a single definition. Many viewpoints. So transparency to a legislature is different than transparency maybe in a member office. A member office has different things that they have to do with their constituents than we may have to do in our legislature. Civil societies are going to have different views of transparency on what the expectation is of parliaments. And the public. One of the great things I heard this morning from the presentation by Brazil was that they actually reach out, the UK as well, they reach out to the public and poll them and try to get information from them that gives them some feedback on what they're doing and whether that's right or wrong and maybe what they should be doing. All good things. So why do we need this? What's important about maybe, not necessarily, I titled this Coming to a Common Definition, but maybe we don't have to get that far. Maybe we can just come to a common set of attributes that we could all look at as saying, yeah, that's all part of transparency. So from an IT perspective, from a technology perspective, when we're trying to do project requirements, in order to be successful, you need to know what you're trying to do. And sometimes I don't think that, although we know we're trying to make a change and we're trying to add a mobile feed to our streaming video, the results of that are pretty concrete. I mean, you're either successful or you're not. But still, you don't really know how many people thought that was good. You don't know how many people are taking advantage of it. So there's still a lot of things that you don't know. Return on investment. If you spend money, how do you go back to leadership and say, you know, for every $2 we spend, you know, 10,000 people are tuning in, or 10,000 people are accessing our websites, something that is quantifiable. Measuring success. I mean, of course, this can be done in a variety of ways. As Jim said, you could have a chart where, you know, an institute like Cato goes out and says, you know, we think you did this, we think you did this. There's some subjectivity to that, certainly. And then just meeting the expectations of the public. Or these are the people, I mean, we call ourselves the people's house, and so this is who we're trying to reach out to let them know what we're doing and keep them involved. Some of the different documents that I had a chance to look at while I was looking, there was something that I saw from a group called the Sunshine Review. Now, this document really focused more on state and local kind of meetings, and you could see that in the types of elements that were part. But what I really liked about it was similar to what Cato did. It was a graphic, so it had categories, and then it had, yes, it's present, no, or, you know, it's in process type of rating on it. Now, they did put a grade on it, but again, a grade can be somewhat subjective. There was another article I saw that it was called The Top 10 Measurements for Transparency, and Ellen Miller was the author, but it was reporting on a Gov 2.0 camp that was, I know, led by Sunlight Foundation, had a lot of participation in that. Now, in measuring transparency between two different types of entities, like an executive branch versus a legislative branch, there are different things that you're looking for. So maybe data isn't data everywhere, so I think there needs to be some distinctions in that. There was a transparency white paper Tom Spangler of Granicus put together that I thought had some really good elements in it in going forward. Maybe not 100% in agreement on some of the places that Tom got with that, with the participation of government, interactive participation, but certainly you know, everyone has their opinion, right? And maybe that's where the public wants to be, and we're not sure about that yet. And then, of course, I had to look at the Global Center, because the Global Center has to have it, right? So I did look out at the Global Center, and although there isn't something specifically on the definition or the measurement of transparency, there are the guidelines for the control and structure of parliamentary websites. There are several elements of that document, such as access to Parliament, visitors. I know earlier in the presentation that I was in, John talked a lot about the visitors and about how they were trying to make sure that they had, when they visited websites, that they got the right kind of message. Content about legislation and plenary activities, In their tools section, they talk about searching and webcasting. And this document was updated a couple of years ago. They also talk about mobile devices. And then they also talk about the design piece, the interaction with the public, the design, the usability, the accessibility, and the language. So a lot of the attributes, again, were all there. As I said, there were lots of definitions. I kind of chose this one to put on here only because it's at a really high level and no one will be offended by it. So openness and transparency can be understood as the availability and accessibility of relevant information about the functioning polity. Very high level. You could read a lot of different things into that. So another idea, what about a checklist? Again, back to what Jim has talked about. What I was looking at more was a self-assessment kind of checklist, as I mentioned. So what are the things that we could put in that checklist that kind of give folks an idea at a glance as to maybe where we stand with regard to transparency and what we're providing? A self-assessment that parliaments can take and display on their websites. So anyway, make a long story short, I came up with this. This mirrors a lot in form what I originally saw with the Sunshine Review, only because I like pictures and it's kind of easy to read, that kind of stuff. So, and I took some of these categories from a variety of the documents that I reviewed. So the idea is a transparency checklist, a self-assessment. Free, live, and on-demand meetings. Now, I mean, that can be different in different parliaments. Certainly a parliament that is not as well developed as other parliaments, maybe all that is voice. Maybe all that is they record their meeting proceedings and they provide them at a library source or something like that, because maybe the internet infrastructure isn't well enough developed in their country to stream it like some of the rest of us do. ADA compliance and closed captioning. Again, maybe dependent on infrastructure in a locality, but certainly being able to provide different aspects to meet the needs of different people. Searchable, pretty self-explanatory. Sharing. Do you have the ability to look at what is presented and immediately share it, whether it's in your social media or via email or multiple manners of sharing the information? Integrated public records. Let me give you a little more definition of kind of what we mean by that. All of us produce a lot of different documents within our meetings. So let's say that we have agendas and meeting minutes and audio-video recordings and different access to digital documents. Some way that we tie all that stuff together, and so that when you search one, you search them all. You're getting, you search on maybe a member's name or the title of a bill, and you get everywhere that title comes up, and you're able to access that information. Data downloads. This could be at an individual vote level. It could also be at a bulk data download type level. Public disclosure. A lot of, if you look at Jim's chart, a lot of the things he has on his revolve around disclosure of costs and spending and stuff like that. And a lot of these other things that I looked at had the same perspective. They want to know what you're spending it on, how much do you have to spend, those types of questions. And then the use of open document standards. Tomorrow there'll be, pretty much a day-long session on XML. I think we can all agree that XML is maybe an open document standard of choice, but there certainly are other ones that maybe there's a stepping stone to getting where you ultimately need to be. Again, just an idea. Maybe this is something, a conversation that we can continue at a future meeting, but something that I just wanted to bring up and discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. We've had two very stimulating presentations. Let's take some comments and questions for our presenters. I have one over here, please.
Just a comment first on the Sunshine Review. they have a nice website. They provide a compelling type of service, but their methodology is really quite poor, because what they do is they rely on sort of the PR, the stated policies of local and state governments rather than what they're actually doing. It would be like relying on the President's open government directive rather than what the agencies are actually doing. So if they have 10% of the roll call votes on, they don't know that 90% aren't, and they just say, oh, there's a couple roll call votes, and they score it. So it's a very casual, quick, based on superficial appearances, and it actually sort of rewards a lot of local governments that are good at PR, presenting themselves as more transparent than they actually are, because they can't tell the difference. So that's just an aside. It doesn't relate to what you were attracted to, which was their nice format.
Exactly. I liked the presentation of the way they provided the presentation. I thought it was easy to understand.
Yeah, and that's how they tend to reward people too. In terms of the definition of transparency, I think it's a mistake to start with transparency as the key concept. That's an auxiliary concept. You have to start with what is the principal-agent relationship you're looking at. In the case of Congress, it would primarily be public and the representative, and then you have to come up with a list of the official actions that the principal would be interested in monitoring. And then only after you've established the relationship and the official actions do you begin to ask the question, what is the way to make it easy for the public, the principal, to monitor those actions? So you've got to be careful not to start with the concept of transparency. Transparency always means you have to be very clear about what type of accountability relationships you're trying to monitor. So just as a framework for defining transparency, you have to be very careful not to start with transparency. That's very much a secondary consideration when you think about it. So anyway, that's all. That's a comment really more than a question.
I'll just say that it's a valuable, particularly the idea of getting away from transparency. It's valuable. I find when working on privacy, if you try to figure out what people are actually talking about rather than privacy, that'll put you in an advantage. Probably the same is true of transparency, and that's what we tried to do in the paper, is to talk about the specific behaviors that will result in transparency. If you set yourself a goal of being transparent, there's no way to know when you've done that. So. You know, the measures that we will use, the House might want to use them because we will be talking about them loudly over the coming months and years. But they might want to pick another set of measures and just pick some measures and work toward them. You'll be better off than a pie in the sky concept like transparency and not actually achieving any goals. That's kind of what happened in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, is that the transparency was out there as a goal, but nobody knew exactly what it was, and so nothing actually happened. Welcome comment. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions and comments? Yes, Daniel.
So I enjoyed both of your presentations, Jim. Of course, I've seen pieces of this one before. Bob, I just sort of had a, we're sort of playing around with definitions of transparency. And, the comments from Jim and others, talked about, needing to drill down a little bit. And I think that actually would be useful to think of it not as a thing, but as a constellation of things. And a lot of it depends on what sort of slice of information you're looking at. For example, if we're talking about data types, which is a very narrow piece of this, then the talk that I gave earlier today with the 10 different principles might be useful. But in other contexts, of course, it's kind of useless. If we're talking about like benchmarks to measure the House or the Senate or others' success, at the Legislative Data and Transparency Conference, there was again a talk on ways of measuring success from sort of the outside perspective, which of course doesn't necessarily get at the inside perspective that you're bringing to this. So my question for you is, what would be helpful? Online, I have a list of, I looked at every single thing that every committee website for the House of Representatives and the Senate has in terms of data elements, the different types of information they make available, And then I came up with a giant list of basically everything that was unique. And I tortured my interns for a month or two and made them look at every single website and say they're doing this, they're not doing this, or they're kind of doing this. So there are other ways, that could be an approach here where, we're all in this room. We could hijack tomorrow's conference, and I'm not suggesting this, and we could make a list of what's commonly available both on official government websites and what's available from the parliamentary monitoring organizations or civil society organization websites. And, are there things, and sort of do a survey and use that as a way of trying to get at the nub of this. As Jim and I and probably other attorneys in the room know, there's all sorts of interesting questions and games that come around with trying to figure out the core definition of what a thing is, where it's always, does this fit, does it not fit? So what will be helpful, and I don't know if there's an answer, but what will be helpful for me, from you in this is sort of what pieces are you trying to get at? And then that might be able to a way of us sort of helping you as you think through that process.
I think it's really, some of the things, for instance, that we do, I know are in that umbrella of the discussion of transparency, okay? So as I mentioned earlier, if you make your video stream available to mobile devices, is that a step in that transparency umbrella? I think so. But maybe there is no end. Maybe it just it keeps on going. But what I think I would like to be able to do is at some point in time know where we are. And I know that, something that, like, if Jim comes back, although I do want to talk to you about that D+, if Jim comes back and says, in his next rating in the fall, which actually I'd like to see it split out between the House and the Senate, but if he comes back and he says, we think you're at these. Now, I will say that some of the things that are on Jim's sheet are not necessarily things that I think that we've been focused on. And maybe there needs to be a discussion as to, okay, here's things we've been looking at. Maybe some of those aren't as important as we think they are, and maybe some of the ones that you have on your sheet are more important, and maybe some of the ones you think are important aren't as important. So I think there's a middle ground. I think there's a middle ground for discussion so that maybe we can provide to some of the parliaments that aren't here, that beyond just a definition of what a proper website should have, that if you're looking to, and maybe the word isn't transparency, but if you're looking to reach out and to be more open to your citizens, these are some of the elements that you should have in your process.
Let me speak to that a little bit. Bob is very gracious, by the way, to engage with me when I issue these grades with basically no notice at all to the organization affected. And I've been thinking myself, actually, that the Senate and House should be separated in the future, because I think the House is going to improve quite a bit, and the Senate might be pretty far behind. So it'll be worthwhile breaking that out for the public to see that there is a difference between the two. When we're modeling legislative process, we focused on formal legislative process only as a way of controlling the amount of stuff that we're going to try to capture. But in a parliament, in a legislature, there is a discrete set of processes that happen that you can model, and you can model the whole thing if you limit yourself to formalities. Not every letter that gets communicated, not every conversation, not every email, not the meetings that happen outside, the lunches. There are lots of things that happen outside of the formal legislative process, but by choosing to model formal legislative process, we made it into a world that you can capture. You can create a model for the entirety of your parliament's legislative process. And then, as Daniel mentioned, you think about the ways that is represented in data. And often it's documents and the way the documents are marked up, but a video is to our way of thinking another form of transcript. It just happens to be a transcript that is a visual transcript and with moving moving people and sounds as opposed to a transcript of the words typed on paper. But all the things that happen in the formal process can be modeled, and then you can think about the ways that they're published and how quickly they're published, the authority and machine discoverability, all the things I talked about. And you really can come up with benchmarks that are sound, that are measurable, and you can tell when you've improved over a prior state of affairs. And the thing that I think is important is that it's a finite world that you're trying to capture. If you restrict yourself to formal, informal is a whole nother ball of wax, which maybe in time there will be brain power and computer power to get after. But that scoping was important for our work, and it's something to think about.
See progress.
Okay, let's take a few more questions. I see a lot of hands in the room. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. So maybe lady at the front first.
Thank you. Sarah Schott from Knowledge is Power. I was tweeting on this conference and saw a tweet from Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, that he had this quote from Winston Churchill I thought was appropriate for this moment, saying, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." And I feel like many governments right now are feeling like they aren't meeting this transparency point. They're not meeting whatever the standards are being determined for them. And yet, I think that these governments won't really reach the transparency point until their documents are working like the web. That within documents we're linking to relevant other documents, research, existing law, maps, data. And so I wonder, to get to that point where our documents are more open and interactive instead of things that we consider just placed on a website or in a data feed, what do you think are the first few challenges ahead? We've talked about some of these today, but it seems like some of these challenges are policy, some are cultural. Maybe if we defined a couple of these challenges, we would be able to then define benchmarks.
Great, thank you. Anne, back.
Anne Washington. I wanted to offer a suggestion. Some of the work that I do is with the W3C, and there's many people in this room who are part of this effort. There's a W3C group on e-government and another one on linked government data. And it's an effort that Tim Berners-Lee feels strongly about, and he's highly involved in everything that's happening in the UK. And he put out a series of 5 stars for government data that I would like to offer to everyone here as a way to think about progress, because I appreciate the question of how do you know how well you're doing, and where are we in the process? And his 5 stars, this is focused on linked government data, so I know that that's slightly different. But first, it's just put it out on the web, put it out on any format. That's 1 star. The second star is put it out in a structured format, like a spreadsheet. The third star would be put it out in a non-proprietary format, like a comma-separated value instead of Excel. And the fourth one would be, as Daniel mentioned, using unique identifiers, so people know that this is the one and only of the item. And then finally, his 5-star model would be to link the data to others, and for that, they're suggesting using RDF, which is a certain technology format. Now, this is just for data, and I just want to introduce the concept that we're talking about data in some cases for transparency, sometimes we're talking about processes, and then sometimes we're talking about the transparency of events. And I think each one has a slightly different form of transparency and definitions that we need to think about.
Thank you. John at the back.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm John Kaizia from UNDESA. I certainly am probably not in the right place from a technical point of view. But since you are discussing transparency, I am involved in promoting transparency in public administration. And the concept of it, as it gets discussed from especially people who design information systems and assume that the availability of data and information means that it is transparent, I think they miss, from a conceptual point of view, they miss one thing. You cannot be transparent if I can't see you. If I can't see through you, it doesn't matter how much information you put out, you still are not transparent to me. And when I say, if I can't see you, it means a lot of things. I might be blind. I might be technically incompetent in terms of the language you are using, signs you are using. And so when you are designing systems of transparency, you don't focus only on yourself, on the thing that is supposed to be transparent, because that reaches a point where it's not the material thing. You are only relevant if you are transparent to someone, and you need to pay attention to the person to whom you should be transparent and look at that condition, to the condition of that person. And this is the predicament of designing ICT systems, especially in developing countries where there is even a lot of illiteracy. Illiteracy from whichever way you want to define that term. So you focus on an organization and it has got a very good open information system with a lot of data. But in terms of being transparent to the society, it is limited by the fact that it has not paid attention to the nature of the audience to whom it should be transparent. And so I guess the point I'm making is that you have got a problem of not paying attention only to yourself, but to the others. And how do you then, as you design systems, cross from yourself and go to the other side and make sure that the language you are talking is the one they will listen to? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Jeff, and then afterwards up at the back. Jeff.
Jeff Griffith, Global Center. Bob made a comment that echoed some others that have been made during the session, and I think it'd be worth pursuing throughout our discussions, and that is there are very important differences that we have to be aware of between those who produce the data and those who use the data or want it for certain purposes. So Jim wants transparent data that has certain characteristics so that he can use it for certain purposes, and Bob thinks he's doing good things in the transparency area in terms of the things he's doing, and they're both right, but they may not be matching because the producers and the users have different frames of reference, have different needs, and I think this is an sometimes overlooked area where we need to figure out what is the impact on those who produce the data in order to achieve the level of transparency that those who use the data would really like to have. I'm reminded when we first started talking about using XML in the House and the Senate, this was many years ago, early days, and the discussion focused around the need to build a new system for editing and producing the text of bills, and the rationale was that this new system, which used these new open standards stuff, was going to allow the users to do a lot of good things. And so the producers said, so you want me to learn an entirely new system and disrupt everything I'm doing so that somebody I don't even know can have better data? And you can see the challenge that we have here. The producers don't necessarily immediately see the benefits of using open standards until it can affect or help them improve what they're doing as well. So we all know the benefits when we receive it. We have to think about the folks who are producing it.
Thank you. Please. Yeah.
Hi. Sort of following up a little bit on both what Ann and Jeff said. Another way to think about the metric is to think of a life cycle or a chain of custody, and what happens when you have silos, and it's definitely the case in the United States, Bob, when you're talking about the House versus the Senate, and information flows from a member of Congress introducing legislation. There's an idea in it. There's a piece of it that goes through and becomes public law, becomes part of the U.S. Code. Then it gets goes over to the executive branch. It's involved with regulations. the regulations then go toward a company that does something based on the regulations. So there's an idea that goes from one silo to another silo, and you can sort of map it. And the question is, if you have good systems, there should be a chain of custody as the information goes through these, that you can sort of track it back through all of them. So as you do these things, if you have a business process model, a UML, look at how information goes through your legislative body, then goes into the public or wherever, that you should be able to see its full life cycle as it goes around and then comes back as a question to change that thing in the future and becomes a new piece of legislation. But unless you can track these things, then also you'll find where the problems are, where the hiccups are between one silo and another silo. That's another way to think of the metrics. And it will, I hope, is create conferences that bring people together to say, oh, we're going to do what we're going to do, you're going to do what we're going to do, but at least we can have a handshake of the information. So systems externally and internally can track things as it goes through. Then you can figure out the metrics based on that, but it's a different way of thinking of it.
Yeah, just before I ask Jim and Bob to respond, maybe after they've responded to you, I wonder if some of the other parliaments might like to share their thoughts on these subjects as well. I'd be interested to hear from Brazil, from the UK, Canada, Denmark, the other countries that are represented here as well, about what they're trying to accomplish, how to measure it. Jim, please.
So I picked up a lovely arc going through all the questions and comments we just got. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to accurately describe the arc that came to my mind while I heard them all. But one of the key points I think that Jeff and John both made is that this is a two-sided relationship between the producer and the user. And the producer and the producer might not know what the user wants, and the user might not successfully communicate to the producer what the producer wants. That's a genuine problem and a genuine concern. In working on our modeling, for example, we tried to bring in as many people as we can, because I have a particular way I want to use the data, and I know other people have ways they want to use the data, and so we tried to model in a way that would work for every use case we could think of. That doesn't mean that we found them all, but the idea, obviously, I think, is to produce data that works for every use case you possibly can. You're really trying to document factual information about what happened in the world that you're documenting, what happened in your parliament, and the way you represent it should work for as many use cases as possible. External use cases like mine, public oversight of the government; internal use cases like successfully running a hearing and keeping members informed about what legislation is what. But it'll very much be, especially for the users. We talk about transparency and measures, but the other side of this is the society getting to start to use the data that comes out there, and that'll be an evolutionary process. When I was writing my paper on these publication practices, I went through a rather extended metaphor to water. So we all like water, right? But if you get water in the wrong formats, it doesn't do you any good. If you're really, really thirsty and someone gives you a huge block of ice, that doesn't make you any better off. If you're really thirsty and you're in a sea of salt water, that doesn't make you any better off. So we need actually pure water. But pure water, what we think of as pure water, is only pure water to humans. There are other species that don't like this kind of water. They actually need a level of salt, or they need other minerals, or whatever it is. So this idea of pure data is actually contingent on what the user community needs. And so it'll be an evolutionary process between what pure data is and what the user community needs. The user community will change to come to the data will change to come to the user community. So it's not going to be a snap of the fingers to fix that. For now, I think it's worthwhile to pick any set of rules like the ones that Anne cited from the W3C, from the ones I've put forward, or any other, and just work toward those, and you're probably going to get closer to transparency that serves all parties. And I guess the interesting question, it's not very important, but it's kind of important, that work that I do is in part technical and serious, and it's also in part political and unserious. That is, part of what I'm doing is I'm talking to people who don't understand transparency, but they just want to have it done. And so I'm going to be talking about this to audiences that don't know what's going on, but they'll come to Bob and they'll say, "Bob, have you got this figured out?" And he'll say, "Well, now that you're paying attention to me, yes, here's what you have to do, or here's what we need, here's where we need to put our resources," and things like that. Because my organization has a media department and a public platform, Bob might have to make his work come a little bit more toward me, perhaps, than other groups that don't have as much of a voice in the society. Again, I'm trying to, what I want to do is come up with data that works for every user community. So anybody who has new ideas, I want to hear from. But part of what's happening here, and this gets back to what Sarah was saying, is going to be a negative conversation, a political style conversation, where I will criticize and I will issue bad grades to people, maybe not necessarily fairly, but it will spur conversation and put Bob and others here in a position to move transparency forward, even if I have to be mean to some people and even if I have to be unfair.
I agree with the discussion about the producers and the users being more in line with what's happening. I had mentioned earlier this morning at a presentation that we had this hackathon early in December, and that I just kind of stayed in the background, and I wanted to go to the different things and listen to what people were saying. And it's funny that, you know, kind of I think I mentioned that one of the big things was we don't want to have to screen scrape anything anymore, which was good because, you know, previously, maybe a couple months before that, we had changed our floor access website, which a lot of people were screen scraping, and we're providing we just upgraded it, and we were providing all the information in an XML file. And really, that project came about as an internal project. When we first went live with House Live, we were screen scraping our own website to get additional information to add to the video file. So we ended up making a change that was good for us in our own process by creating an XML file to do that, and then ended up taking that change that we made to make our own process work better and providing it to the public to then make what they were doing better. So the reason I say that is by listening to what different people thought was their need and being able to say, oh, well, you know, we already do that, but we're not giving it to you. We do, internally, we do several more things in an XML fashion because it makes our own internal process easier. But we don't necessarily provide all that information to everybody because, one, we don't know if it's valuable to you, and secondly, it may not be a finished product. So there's some reasons for maybe not all of it being available. But I think the dialogue, the discussion about, okay, we're producing this, is that of any value? Or, hey, are you producing this? Well, maybe not, but maybe we could be. Again, another example, at the Standards and Transparency Conference, there was a comment made, I think it was one of our technical folks was doing a presentation, and someone said, well, can you provide that list of I think it was committee members? Can you provide that in XML? And she thought about it, and she said, well, yeah, that won't be too hard. Now, we haven't done it yet, but we are working on it. So again, that's a thing like, well, okay, we
current grade C will go to A as soon as that's available.
I'm going to A by the end of this file. So I mean, that's a real statement. I mean, the idea of knowing kind of what people want and saying, and then thinking about it and saying, well, you know, we already do that, or if we made just a little tweak, we could give you that, or in some cases it might be, no, we can't give you that. But I think that's a valuable point.
I had that very same point in mind, actually. The conference that the House Administration Committee put on helped facilitate that kind of conversation. That specific example was in my mind, that there's apparently XML representation of committees and subcommittees that would be really handy. We see on the outside, we see shadows of the fact that there's XML, but we don't actually have the XML. It'd be terrific to get it out there. So encouragement once again.
Okay, thank you very much. Time is moving on. Gerardo, do you want to say something now?
Yes, thank you. I just would like to add another element, which is the international dimension. Bob mentioned the guidelines for parliamentary website, which actually are the guidelines of the Interparliamentary Union. We work together with the Interparliamentary Union, and on that, and those guidelines are very kind of simple guidelines, if you want. There is a long list of documents that parliaments should have on their website, and we know that many parliaments, after issuing the guidelines, actually looked at their websites and the documents they didn't have on their website, but they were actually available internally, and many changed, their way of managing information according to those guidelines. Now, if I understand well, Bob is aiming at a checklist for parliaments that would help parliaments go through it and let's say devise, let me say, not the concept of transparency, but the contribution of documents and availability of documents to transparency. So if we confine ourselves to that dimension of transparency, because I think there are many others, maybe a way of proceeding could be to depart from those guidelines and look at the list of documents, and as Daniel Schumann said before, come up with those documents that actually could be placed, not all of them in Open Document Standard, but some of them in Open Document Standards, looking as well at what the users would like to have, and assess according to the W3C way of doing so, kind of trying to merge several dimensions into one, but departing from an international, recognized at least by parliaments, guidelines that would help devise a checklist. I'm not talking about an assessment from the outside of the parliaments. That, I think, is a different way of proceeding. But at least we could be very concrete and maybe even improve the guidelines of parliamentary website, because already 3 years old, so many things have changed in 3 years. And I'm saying so because I think that we can still say that a parliament is transparent, or at least its website is transparent if they follow the guidelines. But nowadays, many of these documents in the guidelines can be machine-readable documents. And so there is a new bar in the international arena. If we do so, we may be able to facilitate the work of parliaments in not only saying, well, we have this document on the website, and in addition, these documents are available in Open Document Standard. Now, if we want to prioritize the document that civil society, for example, would like to have in Open Document Standard, or records, because we're talking about documents, but in fact it's records, including video and tagged or I don't know, other records, then we should really put our heads together and try to depart from that to arrive to a new guidelines, kind of. That's all.
Thank you. I'll just take one or two final comments before we close up the session. I have lady here. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Liselotte Astrup from the Danish Parliament. I'm head of ICT development there. And I think it's an interesting discussion. Before, one guy here behind me, he said that open standards make not a transparency in itself. And I agreed in that because you mentioned if you were blind or different languages and so on. But I'm not an expert in communication, so what I will say is that transparency can be made without open standards, but it's very expensive and it's very, very inefficient. We heard the guy from the EU said that they have to do a lot of manual work. So what I will say is that our purpose in the Danish Parliament is to, we have been working with XML standards for more than 10 years, I think. And the purpose about that is to make data available in XML so that it can share data, and not only with the Parliament's website, but with all other institutions and external organizations in Denmark. It's really our philosophy that we can spread out the parliamentary data as much as possible. So I think that's an important thing why we are talking about open standards. It's because when we make all our data, legal data in XML, it's possible to exchange the data, to make integration so that we can make the legislation more efficient in the Parliament. And I think that's an issue here, that it's with making open standards. It is in this way that open standards make more transparency, because we can share data with a lot of other people.
And I think the last comment from the back, and then we will close here.
I just wanted to bring in another element in this discussion of transparency from what I have been observing in some parliaments trying to be transparent. They reach a level where they say, we have probably overdone this, can the press get out and we discuss this issue? Now, do we then accept in the concept of transparency also the concept of relativity? That the whole issue of being in Parliament is not only about transparency, it is also about managing society and therefore managing the extent to which you handle power and authority. You see, if you make a glass absolutely transparent, you are going to be dangerous to people, because people will start knocking it, they want to know it is there. In other words, the transparent glass is useful to the extent that someone knows it is there. If it becomes so transparent that you don't even know that's there, then you start hitting against it and it can harm you. Do we have room to discuss to what extent, especially since we are talking about Parliament, we are not talking about any organization, to what extent the Parliament can be transparent? Are we saying it's absolute or relative? And that also has got an implication to those who design the systems. Again, as I say, I am not in your field of ICT, but conceptually, I think there is a point at which one might say, up to what extent must we be transparent?
I enjoy that. I enjoy that comment and the philosophical underpinnings, perhaps, of the question. And maybe it's a little too dangerous to get into the question of what transparency's effect on power is. I think transparency is an important part of fulfilling widely held democratic ideals, but we still want to have. We don't want to have pure majoritarianism in a lot of countries. The United States is a republic, not a direct majority rule country. So the way we are in the United States, I believe, and the way most governments are, transparency has almost no cost. That is, it's a benefit for the functioning of society, the relationship between the society and the government. I can't conceive of a point where transparency does anything bad, to the extent that where a perfectly transparent glass becomes a danger. A perfectly transparent government is, I think, a very, very good thing. So, but it's an important question to ask and something to consider. So I appreciate the point.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We're going to close here today. I think it's been a very stimulating discussion. I think it provides a great platform for the next 2 days on which to build. I'd like to thank you for your contributions. Particularly perhaps you'll join me in thanking the two presenters for their interventions here. I don't know if we have some practical information, perhaps for tonight and tomorrow morning.
Yes. Practical information, we now going to the area where the reception is going to be held, so please take everything, your bags, your coats. There is a coat check in the atrium of the CVC. For tomorrow, you will enter from the same entrance like today. Those with the green badge will come here. Those with the blue badge will be escorted to another area. We forgot to tell that there is an hashtag XML meeting for Twitter. Whoever wants to tweet, use it. Since tomorrow there is going to be 2 groups, I'm already anticipating that on Wednesday at 8:30, the group picture will take place, weather permit, on the stairs of the Capitol.
It'll take place on the steps of the Capitol, and weather not permitting, we'll bring it inside and we'll do it someplace inside. So we're going to do a group picture first thing on Wednesday morning.
So if it doesn't rain, at 8:30 on Wednesday,
on the steps outside the House.
We'll meet there.
Yeah, the CVC side.
The CVC side.
Yeah.
All right? Enjoy the reception.